Welcome to the Roundtable on Human Enhancement. Father Kevin FitzGerald, John A. Creighton University professor and chair of the Department of Medical Humanities at Creighton University, will lead this discussion, which is part of the Bridging Science and Faith project supported by the John Templeton Foundation.
On behalf of the Cura Foundation and the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Culture and Creighton University, I would like to welcome you today to the Human Enhancement Roundtable. This session is part of the 5th International Vatican Conference and the Bridging Science and Faith series, brought to you with the support of the John Templeton Foundation. I'm Reverend Kevin FitzGerald, S.J., the John A. Creighton University professor and chair of the Department of Medical Humanities at Creighton University. We are thrilled to welcome our esteemed speakers, Dr. Ellen Wright Clayton, the Craig Weaver Professor of Pediatrics and Professor of Health Policy, Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, and Professor of Law at Vanderbilt Law School. George Church, PhD, founding core faculty and lead at the Wyss Institute at Harvard University, Professor of Genetics at Harvard Medical School, and Professor of Health Sciences and Technology at Harvard and MIT. Dean Kamen, President, DEKA R&D, Chairman, ARMI, and founder of FIRST. And Monsignor Tomasz Trafny, Head of Science and Faith Department of the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Culture and General Secretary of the Science and Faith STOQ Foundation. This morning, I think it might be good if we start off with a little state-of-the-art technical background for what we'll be discussing today, human genetic engineering. So I'd like to ask George, genomic engineering promises to be a useful tool to improve human lives. What are the current practical impacts of genomic engineering?
Yeah, so the key ones for genomic engineering are agriculture, which can affect health, and direct effects on health as well. But the topic of enhancement is much broader than that, even biological, because it includes vaccines, which are increasingly genetically engineered, and diagnostics, which are the result of synthetic biology and genetic engineering. Enhancement, almost every technology is enhancement, but some of them have different types. Some are enhancements we're ill prepared for. For example, abundance of food results in diabetes, drugs for pain results in addiction, weapons and environment, and so forth. We can prepare for those if we address, through synthetic biology and genome engineering, things like psychiatric disorders and poverty first, before we bring all these other advancements, which only negatively influence some people. There's another set of enhancements that brings up kind of the average. For example, premarital genetic counseling can bring up the average with respect to health. Then there's some where we can equitably increase everybody, so not just the average, but everybody. And these most classically are vaccines, like everybody benefits from smallpox. And there might be vaccines for cancer and aging, and various aging reversal, which could again apply to everyone, as it already has. We've already doubled our average lifespan. And finally, there's enhancements for diversity. So there are some things where we don't want everybody to be better in a certain category. We want everybody to be a little different. For example, going into space, there's a whole new set of enhancements that might be life and death up there, so they wouldn't be considered enhancements up there. They'd be just absolute minimum.
Fantastic. Then let's move on just a little bit. And Dean, I'd like to ask you about this idea of human improvement, because technology is often used to improve human performance and augment organs and physiological defects to enhance a person's quality of life. What hopes and concerns do recent genome engineering developments raise for you?
Well, I think whether it's specifically genome or any other kind of engineering advancement or enhancement, since time began, it carries with it two burdens or opportunities. Advancements in technology tell us what we can do that we couldn't do before, whether it's fly to the moon or you name it. But technologists advance what we can do. It's people like you, I hope, and ethicists and lawyers that tell us what we should do with these new technologies as they come around. Because I think without exception, every technology that gives us the power to do something good produces the risk of using it for nefarious purposes. And that's an age-old problem. And so I think the more we can accelerate the ability for technology to do more and more and more powerful things, and genetics is almost beyond whatever we've done in the past. You know, the steam engine improved our muscles, and the computer said we can, calculate faster. But when you start getting to people like Dr. Church who can change the way life evolves, you're just amplifying something that's even more potentially beneficial and therefore even more potentially dangerous to humanity. So we have to be very careful what we do with it, but we have to keep moving forward and making sure that people understand how to apply newer and better technologies for good.
Thank you, Dean. Ellen, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure, I'd love to. First of all, I want to make the point that enhancement is not clearly defined. And so the distinction between that and therapy is often quite blurry. In addition, before I go on to that, I want to make the point that enhancement has a bad name, and it shouldn't, because in point of fact, our job is to enhance the lives of others, that we are supposed to enhance the lives of our children. And in fact, we suggest that when parents don't pay attention to how their children grow, whether they learn, whether they learn manners, whether they follow good morality, we think that parents are not doing their job. So enhancement is actually part and parcel of what we are called to do. And this comes out in a variety of ways. We have, as a species, managed to come up with some extraordinary tools to improve human well-being. Vaccines are a really clear example of this. The lifespan of humanity has doubled in the last decade, and it is in part attributable to what we've done with vaccines. And one of the major challenges that we're facing today in today's world is how we are going to get COVID vaccine all around the world to help individuals avoid this pandemic. This is really important. Other ways we've enhanced lives is that we have provided clean air and clean water, which makes enormous difference in human well-being. All of this can be understood as enhancement for good. Now I want to make the point about the special role of genetic engineering, which is obviously our topic today. When I was a resident, we were doing what we called back then bone marrow transplants for severe combined immunodeficiency, which is a single gene disorder that means that you can't fight infections, and so it's lethal. But the therapy itself had a lot of side effects because you basically had to wipe out whatever immune system they had in order to make this work. And a lot of these kids died. At the same time, we knew that we could treat sickle cell disease, which is the quintessential single gene disorder, same base pair variant in every single person. You could treat it that way, but it was just simply too toxic. So fast forward to 2021, when we can think about targeted gene editing that can fix, we hope, can just fix the particular variant that's incorrect and make people be well. Now, we aren't there yet. There's still some side effects and from these interventions. But the fact of the matter is, once this gets worked out, and it will get worked out, we will be able to provide therapy for millions of people with single gene disorders without almost killing them. I mean, that's really kind of astonishing. And if you want to view that as enhancement, I guess maybe you can. But I think that I mean, this is what we are supposed to be doing, developing interventions that can help all people do better. That's enhancement.
Thank you, Ellen. Tomasz, George, anything to add?
So I think I agree with many comments and statements that were said here. However, in humanities, we make a distinction between improvement and enhancement. So maybe it's not really a clear distinction between these two things, but in humanities, we tend to understand improvement as let's say, as trying to reach certain level of performance through natural means. So for example, pushing yourself through exercise, through learning, while enhancement, it would be to reach the same level of performance and maybe even a better performance through artificial means. And I agree, I mean, I'm a moderate enthusiast of technologies because really they changed our lives. And we can see when I started to study electronics, the first computer I saw was maybe bigger than the room when I am sitting in. So, and there was no even monitor. There was a performant, a performant paper, and you had to read this. Now we can see each other, we can talk to each other. So technologies changed our life, and I am happy of that. But at the same time, I agree with Dean that we have to be conscious about the risks. And when we are talking about human enhancement, I am really thinking about the safety. This is one of the borders that we need to think about. And for example, where is the line? Where is the limit of this? I am constantly reading things and I'm trying to figure out how to address this issue, because when I am talking to students, they see there are no limits at all. Whatever is available, we should do. Well, what about a new species? If we really modify ourselves in irreversible way, and we introduce irreversible changes in our genome. So I think that there are some anthropological issues, although those technologies are powerful, wonderful, that we need to explore them, and we need to use them wisely for the benefit of all.
Interesting, thank you. So George, what would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say that accepting the definition of improvements as natural, we are part of nature. So things that we produce like clothing and houses can be considered natural or unnatural depending on your inclination. Even very primitive technologies are unnatural, like harnessing fire. I think that when we worry about whether these technologies, whether we're ready for these technologies or not, safety came up a couple of times. Safety is the purview of the Food and Drug Administration or the EMA in Europe, and we can't just do anything. All drugs have to be approved for that. If we do anything outside of the FDA, then there are legal consequences. So now I don't think everything should be done by legality. It should be done, by moral education and so forth. But there is that safeguard, which is really quite a high bar to traverse. It typically takes 10 years to get through those clinical trials. Admittedly, we went a little bit faster on the COVID because the crisis was so imminent.
So that raises an interesting question, George, as you mentioned, the FDA and the EMA. Of course, there are other places in the world that may not have the same sorts of regulatory structure in place, and they may have a different perspective on this. So one of the issues that often comes up for me is that whole idea of genetically modified foods and how in one sense, that was considered to be an enormous advance and benefit, and yet was often not acceptable to a large number of people. So that raises a very interesting question. And Ellen, since you were talking about benefits and burdens a little bit, how do you engage people who hold significantly different views about what's an improvement, what's an enhancement, and where we should be going?
Well, again, we're facing that right now. And I think the first thing we have to do is listen, and listen respectfully and try to understand, what they're concerned about. I actually am on a state advisory committee about vaccine allocation in Tennessee. And what we're finding is that a lot of our minority communities really like the idea of one shot as opposed to two. And that is of enormous importance to them and makes a big difference in how we proceed with this. Others, I think it will be more challenging, those who view this as not an illness, as as an intrusion on their liberty. I think that is a harder issue. But one of the things I think that we're really learning is that first of all, that what we as a scientific community thinks is a good thing to do is not a view that's shared by everybody else. And that I think that we as a scientific community have to have some humility about, what our claims are, and also about how we interact with other people. And then we have to listen and figure out where they are and talk with them and address their concerns if we're going to do this. And I think that the impact of the GMO foods was a opportunity missed, as it turns out, and tragically so. And I think that the lesson that we need to learn from this is that we need to be humble in our claims. We need to realize that we can make mistakes, and we need to be open to conversation. And I think that really is, we are really learning that lesson right now. And it's one that I think applies across the board.
So Dean, you've been on the cutting edge of technology for a while. How do you engage with people who see things significantly different than you do?
Well, there's many different reasons people can see it differently. Some are very reasonable. Some are due to ignorance, and that should be fixed. But before we deal with that issue, I would like to violently agree with Dr. Clayton's first statement, which is there's not a bright line between an enhancement and a therapy or an improvement. I think, in fact, that's the wrong place to try to distinguish between what we should do and what we should not do. I think the real moral issue there that makes it hard to decide what we should do versus shouldn't do, forget the safety stuff. Always it should be safe. And yes, the FDA. But even if you get past it could be safe and put that one aside for a second, the issue of whether we should be doing it or not, which has been turned into this false argument of it's an enhancement, as she pointed out. These are all enhancements. The issue is, can you make it so available that there's equity in it? For instance, if you said it's not about whether this is an enhancement or not, but let's say in the early days of dialysis, they figured out how to make this work, but it was so expensive, it was only available to a few people that could afford it. Well, that's a real moral dilemma. You mean this person who has a little kid whose kidneys aren't working is going to watch their child die, whereas this person will have access to a therapy. You might then say that therapy was an enhancement. But if I said to all of you, hey, there's a new vaccine or a new therapy that could make everybody healthier, or everybody live longer, or everybody smarter, you would say that's a good thing. We all want that. I think drawing the line between it's a therapy and an enhancement is really a subtle way of confusing. Everybody deserves to have some appropriate natural baseline. So we like that. We call that a therapy. If you're missing that, if you have sickle cell but somebody else doesn't, we'll fix it. But what if you could create a way to give everybody a better capability to do something, which is what technology is for, but at least in its early days, it's not available to everybody. That's a moral dilemma. You know, people that have a disease that can't be cured, it's a tragedy for all of us. But once we have a way to cure it, but only have a small amount of it available, and somebody doesn't get it, it's not only a tragedy, it's a moral dilemma. And as technology is moving faster and faster forward, I think what Dr. Church would tell you, Dr. Clayton would tell you is, inevitably, in the early days of any of these possibilities becoming a reality, they look like enhancements. But once they're commonly available, they're therapies. When I was a kid, nobody had the internet. Now you hear people running around saying high-speed internet access is a human right. Well, I guess you and I were all born with no human rights because none of us had that. But once it became scalable, it was reasonable that everybody gets to benefit and enjoy it. And in this case of genetics, it's going to be a really, really, really powerful debate when certain capabilities will become available, but only in a limited way because technology hasn't figured out how to scale them yet. And some people will benefit from it for a while other people can't. And we will say that was an enhancement versus a therapy instead of saying that was a path to a therapy that will bring better life to everybody.
George, you have anything to add?
No, I completely agree with Dean on most of those points. It's an enhancement relative to our ancestors, rather than an enhancement relative to each other. That's the critical thing here. Technologists do have something to say. It's a governmental issue, but also we've brought down the cost of certain biotechnologies like DNA sequencing by 20 million fold. So that shows that we can do it. We've made certain pathogens extinct. Smallpox, guinea worm, polio, leprosy, and more will be extinct. That is a tremendous positive for everybody in the world because they don't even have to pay for vaccines or drugs anymore. So we have the ability to do that, and I think it's our obligation to seek ways to radically bring down the cost and improve the quality.
Tomasz, you have something from the sort of more moral, ethical perspective?
Well, I agree that if we apply those technologies to our well-being, to the health, whatever we can do to overwhelm, let's say, diseases, to kill, pathogens, and really to improve human life, it's good. However, when we are talking about human enhancement, very often we are talking really about genetic modification. And there is a huge community of people who define themselves transhumans. And I think it's worth it to hear what they would like to see. And they would like to see radical changes in terms of, let's say, designing humans, in terms of almost pushing us or human beings to reach the level of being superior species. And I think it's very interesting and intriguing issue that biotechnologies have to face and have to address.
So it raises some interesting questions, the points that you make, because again, we always seem to bump up against what people consider to be benefits where others might not, what some might consider to be insignificant risks and others consider to be significant. So just to hear from all of you, where would you draw a line with particularly genetic technologies now to say this is a line we should not cross? And if there is no line, then that's fine. But do you have one? And if so, or if not, why? So let's start with you, Tomasz.
So I will design a triangle where one line would be the safety, definitely. And we know that, and I appreciate what Dr. Church said. I mean, in US and in Europe, we have institutions that are watching and controlling these things. But in many countries, and there are people, online, you can see how many people are trying to set up their own labs, doing crazy things, and even if they are not able to introduce or to let's say cause huge changes, I mean, those technologies are already available, and the safety is the primary, let's say, borderline. The second one is, I would say, to not really destroy who we are, to not introduce irreversible changes in our genome that eventually will put us, our species, into the risk of existence and living. And the third line would be really the accessibility to everyone, because if we will face the situation where biotechnologies will start to introduce these changes with discrimination, we will face a new social reality, because disparities will be even bigger than we have today. And I think this triangle could be, let's say, a safe point or safe place for how to think about biotechnologies.
So good, Dean, please.
So once again, I think there's a fundamental set of issues that hasn't changed much. It's just when you direct it to genetics, you're looking at maybe new ways to make your trade-offs. For instance, you were talking about genetically modified foods. That might have been a mistake. Well, it depends. What is the risk and what is the benefit? And that varies dramatically to different people. Doctors have had to face that issue. What is the benefit? What is the risk over their entire careers? You wouldn't give somebody a new drug to get rid of a sniffle if there was any reasonable risk. Whereas you might give somebody a very dangerous drug, again, as Dr. Clayton said, if they will most assuredly die of this glioblastoma unless we try something. So the risk and benefit always are part of making this decision. There isn't a bright line. But for instance, what if in the developing world countries, there is for sure a famine going on, and thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people are going to die, but there is a genetically modified wheat that will grow in the swamp or in the desert, or it is for sure that in the short run, we could feed millions of people by doing this and give them some chance at survival, whereas without it, they won't. You would make a very different decision about whether that genetic modification was a reasonable thing to do versus you're sitting here in the lap of a lot of food wondering, are there unintended consequences that might be bad? And I think people tend to therefore confuse safety issues with morality issues, and it's a little naive to do that. I keep coming back to, we should understand the technology, we should understand the potential benefits and the potential risks, but then separately look at, if those benefits can be made, how do we make sure we can scale them up equitably to everybody that needs them? And all of those things need to be considered before we make policy.
So before we move on to others, Dean, I'd just like to pick up on something you said, this idea of what if there were this tremendous famine? Wouldn't we then say, okay, we have this technology, let's apply it? Not an expert in this area, but my understanding is about a third of the food we grow is wasted today in the world. So one response to you might be to say, well, we don't need the genetic technology to solve that problem. We just have other ways that we should solve it, yet we never do. How do you respond to that?
Again, I would say to you, the job of the technologist has been to make all these options available. It's the job of all of us, including those technologists, to decide which ones to develop and make sure they're equitably deployed. And frankly, society has not done as well at dealing with some of those issues as the ever-increasing rate at which technology makes these alternatives possible. We are not very good at organized societies of figuring how to efficiently and equitably deploy all of them, which is why you see so much frustration in the world. Again, I think some of it's misguided. People think that there's a deliberate inequity, and I think there's just an evolving system that, you know, the future comes to some places faster than it comes to others. We should try to fix that, but it didn't mean that there was a nefarious intent when Dr. Church came up with a way to help this baby, but it wasn't immediately available to all other babies. It wasn't because he doesn't like those other babies. It wasn't that there was a plot among the advanced technologists, but there has to be a better dialogue between all people as we figure out how to deal with the issues that are created by the opportunities of better technologies. And there'll be none where that's more critical than ones that deal with life and health, people's families, people's kids. That's way more important than whether you got your internet before the neighbor of yours or some color TV of 50 years ago, which people coveted. Now we're dealing with technologies that once they're available to somebody can differentiate between life and death. And how do we deal with the way to scale those things?
And George, how do you deal with that?
Well, I think that I've mentioned bringing down the cost as one way of doing it. Improving the communications can be done by dealing with more common wavelength. For example, TV and movies is one way that people can get a very high dose of information in a way that's very palatable and understandable. So we work with screenwriters quite a bit. Books, newspapers, magazines. These things put it in a format that they can relate more easily. I think a bioweather map would be a good thing. They relate to weather maps. They should be able to relate to kind of day-to-day changes in pathogen distribution. I think that's something these are the sort of ways of making sure the dialogue includes all people rather than just the top ethicists and top scientists.
And Ellen?
So I think there are several things to say here. One of them is that the issue of disparity and inequity is, I think, a crisis of our world today. And one of the things that makes it a crisis is that we can see it. I mean, we know for sure that these disparities exist. And we know for sure that they have grown, astronomically. And I think that that one of the things that we are called to do is to figure out how to deal with that. I have to say that it's a very large issue, but one that really, I think, is one of the guiding problems of our time. The other thing that I would like to particularly pick up on Tomasz about is that the risk of error is something that technologists need to be thinking about and to realize that our regulators can't entirely solve. And the area where this is coming out most prominently in the debate about genetic engineering is heritable gene editing, which is that we realize that even as cool as CRISPR-Cas9 and some of the follow-on technologies are, that they're not perfect. And so the idea that we can actually do this editing with total precision, which is something that humans have a hard time achieving in general, is something that we haven't gotten to yet. And that thinking about making changes that are going to be heritable downstream is really, that's a big lift. And it's one that requires, I think, a great deal of humility. And there are big debates about this. Some would say that we just shouldn't be doing this at all. Others would say that maybe we could do this only in extremely limited circumstances where prospective parents can't have a child and that's genetically related to them in any other way without this kind of intervention. But the ground that we're talking about here is very, very narrow. Now, having said that, here in the United States, this technology is not very regulated at all. The FDA does get in this space a little bit, but assisted reproductive technology isn't. And so, so I think we have some, some big issues and in terms of how we think about disparities, how we think about desirable, appropriate use of these technologies has got to turn in a very important way on how we regard ourselves and how we regard others. And the question that we have with the transhumanists, for example, who want, to change, modify themselves, is that, are we going to say that they can do that to themselves because that's a liberty interest in this country? Or do we say that this is something that we want to prohibit? I suspect in the United States, we'll take the liberty interest view. But I think, so the things I want to talk about are liberty, equity, how we regard ourselves and others. And I think that those are both matters for what technologists need to be thinking about. And I know they do. I mean, I talk with folks all the time, but I think it's also something for a larger, debate about how we want to structure this. So I think all these themes have really come up in our conversation so far, but I just really want to bring it up in the context of the issue of heritable gene editing, because this is where it really cones down, I think, in a way that really focuses our attention.
So Ellen, you raised, again, one of the major neuralgic issues right now with this particular technology, and that's the heritable genetic engineering and the way in which that might be envisioned by different people around the world. And I'm intrigued by your emphasis, of course, in the United States on individual liberty, which is not necessarily a cultural perspective that other countries have or other cultures and communities have. How do we go about engaging in that discussion globally? So, George, if you know as well as I, this is something that's come up time and time again in the genomic research community, that we have to have this global engagement to understand what people think. Where do you think we are in terms of that global engagement, and how would you see moving that forward?
Well, sometimes I feel that the germline issue is a red herring. It's a bit of a distraction. We have a tendency as a population not to embrace technologies that are not useful, and it is not clear that germline would be useful, at least in the short term, because almost everything you can do with germline you can do some other way, and the other ways range from somatic gene therapy, in vitro fertilization, genetic counseling, you name it. Even these enhancements, they can be done. And indeed, there's a much bigger market for people that are already born, which is 7.7 billion, relative to people who are not yet born, which is just a few, maybe 100 million a year. So from a practical standpoint, I don't think there's a high motivation to germline. We talk about irreversibility. It seems unlikely that if we can go forward with a mutation that we can't go backwards, and as time goes by we get better and better at going both forward and backwards. So something that we did in 2021 is probably going to be more easily reversible in 2023 than it is today. So I'm not sure I buy the irreversible argument either. Nevertheless, we should be on our guard. We should have a broad communication about that, but we shouldn't get distracted by saying, if we solve the germline problem, we've solved a lot of other problems, because I think some of the things we worry about, so we haven't actually said what the transhumanist boogeyman is yet. I would love to hear what everybody feels like. My guess is it's cognitive enhancement. And we're going to do cognitive enhancement in a variety of ways, which are not germline as well. And do we want to have the same conversation about that? I think it's a tougher conversation to say you can't enhance yourself as an adult than to say you can't enhance your child. But in reality, there's going to be a great deal more temptation to enhance adult cognition because we have an aging population where cognitive decline is common. And so just in the process of fixing cognitive decline, we may come up with a variety of technologies that result in cognitive enhancement available to adults. So if we want to regulate that aspect of transhumanism, if that's what we're worried about, maybe there's some other boogeyman that we can bring up, then we need to address a whole variety of therapies that result in cognitive enhancement and elimination or reduction of cognitive decline.
And certainly these kinds of global conversations can certainly learn from each other depending on the topic. So Dean, obviously cognitive enhancement could happen in a variety of ways. It wouldn't happen to necessarily just be genetic. So maybe there's a synergy there that we could tap into to say, we may need to have these conversations and sort of open them up and make them a little more broad.
Yeah, and I think, once again, Dr. Clayton brought up a very good example of the liberty issue, which isn't a genetic issue, it's a human. I mean, for instance, I think, and again, I think she's right, in America, we always err on the side of personal liberty. Yet, I think we believe you're allowed to sit in your home and get so drunk you can't walk across the room. But you're not allowed to get into a car and drive down the highway that way. And it's because you have the personal liberty to get drunk. You don't have the personal liberty to hurt or kill somebody else. That's irresponsible. I think in the same way that all these issues related to genetic enhancement need to deal with, if you're doing it because you made a choice that might affect only you for better or worse in somebody else's mind, that should be viewed through a different lens than if you make this change available to yourself or somebody else, could it have consequences to a broader group in your society that, while it may be something you want or may in fact objectively make your life better, it has a negative impact on others. And that question of where you draw that line, I'll keep saying once again, that question can't be answered by the technologist alone. It requires a society to fully understand the risks and the benefits of all these things. But the rate at which some of these things are becoming possible is making it so that only a very few people, you've got Dr. Church, you have a very, very small cross-section of humanity here that is even capable of dealing with what the real issues, opportunities, and consequences are. And we've got to broaden that really quickly.
In order to do that broadening, it would seem to me that there might be a need for organizations that can have that sort of global reach. And I don't know, one just pops into my mind. I think it's called the Catholic Church. So Tomasz, the Catholic Church tends to be pretty much everywhere. What is your experience of trying to do these kinds of global engagements in terms of discovering people's values and fears and their hopes and interactions with technology?
Well, definitely the reason why we started the discussion many years ago with Dr. Smith was to bring those issues to the public and also to engage our communities, because first, not only because the church is spread around the world, but also because we have very powerful educational system, which I think needs to be updated, needs to be probably modified, because many often even, when we are talking about training priests, or let's say seminarians that they are going to be priests, they still are listening and learning things that are far away from what science is doing. And I think this is one of the challenges that we are facing and we are trying to do, is to engage our students, to tell them that there can be a dialogue, we can talk to each other, we can be engaged with sciences. And probably it would, if we would be careful listeners and students of science, probably we will start also to redefine some fundamental philosophical concepts that are very, very powerfully spread around the world. And I think the educational system is one of the crucial points for the Catholic Church. We need to think about that. We need to update it, and we need to be engaged with scientists to make it, let's say, more, not only acceptable, but more credible. Because I am really convinced that sciences can help us to understand nature, can help us to understand ourselves. But at the same time, philosophical thinking, even theological intuitions can bring us something or can elevate some sensitivity of human beings to dimension that usually science do not deal with, like values or, let's say, ultimate dimension, transcendence, and so on. So I think communities and education is the key, and that's why we started this. We want to make science accessible, but at the same time to learn from science and to see if our language or our way of thinking can be helpful also for scientists.
And that's, of course, an amazing challenge on this idea of bringing all these different perspectives together and somehow achieving goals and benefits that are widely sought and embraced, which then gets us back to reality, which is we do not have unlimited resources. We do not have the ability to solve all problems at once. So what I'd like to end with in our last few minutes here is to ask each of you, how would you argue we should prioritize those scarce resources we have in terms of trying to achieve that broad and substantive benefit that we've all discussed, which would be there accessible to everyone? And so I'll let whoever wants to jump in first, but how do you go to the world and say, we really need to prioritize right now? And this is how technology, particularly perhaps genomic editing technologies, might add to that or not.
I think we need to come together. This is an important thing, and to join forces. Many people are doing things separately in very fragmented way. And this is like in our communities, people are doing small things, and many often we don't share resources, we don't share knowledge, we don't share sentiments. So we drive things along. I think come together, it's the key, and start to share.
And I was going to say that there actually is a lot of common ground. We don't see this in the Congress at the moment, but I've actually worked with the Episcopal Church over the year to talk about genetics. And frankly, a lot of what we've talked about today, about regard, about responsibility, about humility, about being aware of, the possibility of error, are all things that we can, that religious discourse and scientific discourse have in common. And so I think that I actually regard this as a fruitful and potentially very generative conversation. So
great, thank you. Dean?
I think the scientists, the George churches, have to keep making more of these great things possible, but then the technologists and engineers have to figure out how to bring them to scale so that once they're possible, it's also realistic to make them in an equitable way available to the whole world, because if they're all possible and they all can improve quality of life and all be made accessible, we all win. If you lose any one of those, if you end up doing something that turns out unintentionally to be unsafe and it gets amplified, that's bad. If you come up with a great thing, but it's not made available across the world, that's unfair, that's unethical. So all of these things have to be moving together. They have to be balanced, but it's going to require a broader distribution of real understanding of science and technology across the world. Otherwise, we're going to keep seeing more anger and more frustration as the inequities grow.
And George, we started with you, so you get the final word.
Yeah, so I think sharing is great. I think scaling is great, as Dean says. But your question was about priorities. And I think our priorities should be on the least wealthy parts of our world. And that is not just selfless. It is not just about sharing. It's even selfish. If many of the diseases and the problems of the world come from these inequities, and we've talked about this in a number of ways, but I want to say we aren't spending as much money on malaria and HIV and vitamin A deficiency as we could. There are technological and solutions to some of these things that could, if you have a solution like, well, the food isn't well distributed or there's safe sex isn't being used, you can't just say, oh, that's going to happen someday. You have to try another route. With vitamin A deficiency, you can't just say, oh, there are vitamin pills, there are better foods that you can eat. Golden rice is a potential solution, and we need to aggressively pursue it. And you can't just say it's expensive because, $1 billion here and there to make sure these technologies get to the people who need them is nothing compared to the $16 trillion that we're spending on COVID-19 and a variety of other problems that originated because of these inequities. So I think that we need to, if we want to save money, the best way is to prioritize, which was your question.
Thank you so much, Dean, Ellen, George, and Tomasz, for taking the time to be here with us today and sharing your insights on human enhancement. As we continue to see breakthroughs as a result of gene editing and other technologies, we must consider the benefits to society as well as the unintended consequences that may occur. With innovation and scientific discovery progressing so rapidly, we need to look at the impact on society and culture, as well as ethical considerations, such as affordability and access for everyone. We hope our audience found today's roundtable informative, and we will be sending you a follow-up questionnaire to get your feedback. Please take the time to share your views with us. In the meantime, stay safe and healthy, and on behalf of the Cura Foundation and the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Culture, thank you for joining us.